All right, so 2 weeks ago, chapter 11, we discussed money and wealth. Guess what we're going to discuss tonight? Other points of money and wealth, because that's a big topic again in this one, and it brings up some topics that we didn't cover the first time. So 2 weeks ago, if you remember discussing money and wealth, there were kind of 4 points that we talked about. The first one was the idea, Proverbs 11 talks about the idea of being blameless, that wealth is not the problem, it's are you going to be blameless? And the metaphor that they used, if you remember, was the dishonest scales versus accurate weights. So being blameless when talking or when dealing with money and wealth. The second one was being people of generosity. That came up in chapter 11. In chapter 11 also was when we discussed that phrase about putting up security for a stranger in verse 15 of chapter 11. And so the principle there was being wise enough to say no when it comes to wealth and money. And then the last one was not trusting in riches for our welfare. So you're going to see different verses come up, and we'll discuss some other points about how we handle money and wealth in this chapter. So verse 1, a wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker does not respond to rebukes. From the fruit of their lips, people enjoy good things. So one of the interesting things about the next several verses is Solomon uses the 5 senses as a metaphor in several different verses. And so from the fruit of their lips, people enjoy good things, but the unfaithful have an appetite for violence. And similar to some other times when I've talked about basically how people move forward in unrighteousness, I would suggest this. The idea of an appetite for violence is maybe a 3-step process. And the first is the desire to observe. And of course, we have been a very violent culture in our everything from movies, TV shows, social media, with everything being videotaped. It's not just fictional violence, in a movie, it's actual violence that's being, phone videoed by people, and then they're putting it up online. And so this idea of, in verse 2, of an appetite for violence, the first step is the desire to observe. And there is something about when news happens that violence, it tends to draw our attention. And I think that there's several different reasons for that. One of them is the sin nature, is we want to see things go sideways. The sin nature will actually be drawn to things going wrong. So the desire to observe. The second level of the appetite for violence is the desire to cheer, is being a bystander and reveling in violence. And there's a lot of people that never get to that point. The problem is there are people who get to that point where they see violence occur and they'll stand and they'll laugh and they'll think it's funny. They'll want more of it, that sort of thing. And we're starting to see a culture that's doing more and more of that, of not just as a desire to observe, but a desire to cheer. And then, of course, the third level is the desire to join in. The end product of an appetite for violence is taking a place at the table. And unfortunately, in our culture, we're seeing more and more of that, and we see it around the world because we live in a broken world. Verse 3, those who guard their lips preserve their lives, but those who speak rashly will come to ruin. A sluggard's appetite is never filled, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. The righteous hate what is false, but the wicked make themselves a stench. And so there you have, again, the idea of using the senses as a metaphor. The righteous hate what is false, but the wicked make themselves a stench and bring shame on themselves. Righteousness guards the person of integrity, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. One person, and here's where we start to get into verses that again talk about the issue of money and wealth. And this one we'll actually discuss. Let me read it and then I'll make a statement about this one. One person pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. Now, in the midst of all these other wise sayings, this seems like it's just an observation, not like an actual is wisdom in this phrase, and we'll talk about that in the discussion, because I'm a little puzzled. It seems like that's just more of an observation than any kind of a wisdom kind of statement, which seems odd because almost all the statements are wisdom statements. Verse 8, a person's riches may ransom their life, but the poor cannot respond to threatening rebukes. The light of the righteous shines brightly, but the lamp of the wicked is snuffed out. Where there is strife, there is pride, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. And what I would tell you is that one is a good reference point back to last week when we talked about the idea of discipline, is how does one discipline themselves. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Whoever scorns instruction will pay for it, but whoever respects a command is rewarded. The teaching of the wise is a fountain of life, turning a person from the snares of death. Good judgment wins favor, but the way of the unfaithful leads to their destruction. All who are prudent act with knowledge, but fools expose their folly. A wicked messenger falls into trouble, but a trustworthy envoy brings healing. Whoever disregards discipline, there it is again, comes to poverty and shame, but whoever heeds correction is honored. A longing fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but fools detest turning from evil. Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffer harm. Trouble pursues the sinner, but the righteous are rewarded with good things. This next verse we'll talk about a little bit also. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. An unplowed field produces food for the poor, but injustice sweeps it away. Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. The righteous eat to their heart's content, but the stomach of the wicked goes hungry. So a couple points in regards to wealth in this particular chapter. The suggestion here is that financial success can be a natural byproduct of a wise life. Now, I want to stop there and say, well, let's be careful. That doesn't mean that every wise person is rich, and it doesn't mean that every foolish person is not going to be able to in some way gather wealth. So one thing I thought of with this is, I don't know if you've ever heard this quote, but going going to a school that was a part of the Wesleyan Church, the Methodist tradition. Of course, John Wesley was discussed a lot, and he has a famous quote where he says this about financial success or financial dealings. He said this: earn all you can, save all you can, give away all you can. That was one of his more well-known quotes. So financial success can be a natural byproduct of a wise life. There's a suggestion in this chapter, and we can discuss this a little bit, that the wise person has. Let me make this statement and then try to unwrap it. Wealth can be accrued through righteousness or through unrighteousness. The suggestion in this chapter is that it's not that the unrighteous can't be wealthy, it's that how they'll handle their money will be vastly different. I can't remember which verse it was, but there was a verse that suggested basically that the unrighteous people who have wealth fritter their money away. So the unrighteous fool squanders, the righteous wise store up. And again, that goes back to what we talked about last week, the idea of delayed gratification, diligence, prudence, being willing to discipline oneself. So the unrighteous fool squanders, the righteous wise store up. And it even says in verse 18 about the squandering life, that person disregards discipline. And then the store up life, the righteous wise who store up, verse 22 says leaves an inheritance. And think about this, and we'll have some discussion on this, is why does God value generational wealth? Because in Scripture, there is very clear, it's much more pronounced in the Old Testament, but there's very much a clear idea in Scripture that the person who gains wealth or land or something during their lifetime, the natural thing, not that they shouldn't be generous with it towards others, but the natural thing is always that they are passing on an inheritance to their children. And so I want to talk a little bit about why does God value generational wealth? What is it about that he tends to highlight that, and especially in the Old Testament, in regards to this is important for you to have something to pass down to your children. All right, let's take a break, and then we'll talk a little bit about wealth, and then we'll also talk about a couple other particular verses in here that are different topics but are interesting to discuss.
It's interesting because some time ago I was reading back, I think it was in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon says, what's the purpose of earnings if you're not going to enjoy it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's like multiple things that are supposed to be done with wealth, and one of them is that I don't think God has a difficulty with you enjoying wealth as long as that's not the only thing you're doing with it. That's the issue, and that's where you have to have a real balanced approach to your money, your wealth, what you do with it, how you handle it. All right, let's take a break.
We'll be back in about 1 minute.
All right, so let's start off talking about the one of the main themes of the chapter, again, is dealing with wealth and money. And let's specifically talk this through this very strong Old Testament idea. I don't think it disappears in the New Testament. It's not highlighted in the New Testament, but I think it's still very much at work within the people in the New Testament and for thousands and thousands of years. Why does God value generational wealth? What is it that he, because there's verses in Proverbs here, there's other places where it's very important for, and obviously in a patriarchal society, the issue was very important for the father to pass down the land, the inheritance, the money, the sheep, whatever it was, down to the sons. Why is that important?
Well, I think when you've got parents or grandparents, parents, children, and things are getting passed down, or maybe in Old Testament times it was like, okay, yes, I still have to work, but I don't have to work as hard, so I can spend more time giving honor and glory to God for what He has provided. Does that make sense? So there's less time, instead of 60 hours a week of work in the field and everything like that, maybe there's 30 and more time is spent with going to temple, doing things for others.
You mean as people get older, or just?
Well, no, the passing down.
Okay.
Where the younger people don't have to, yes, they're still going to have to work hard.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But because they've been given an inheritance and they're not starting off from ground zero, it's like, okay, I've got stuff to live on, but then I can also do things for others,
Okay.
do things for God, worship God, and spend more time with God.
So in essence, I'm better prepared to have a more balanced lifestyle if there's an inheritance passed down. That's one opportunity.
Balanced lifestyle, but also a closer relationship with God, because I'm not spending so much time working.
Just trying to pay the man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think it's important. He wants us to be good stewards of what we have.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are, then we will have things left over to pass.
And family is the first model of where you stored your time and your energy towards. So the idea of proper stewardship, a wise stewardship would push towards helping your family in whatever way you can. Okay? Other things? One thing I think of is in the ancient Near East and in cultures that are third world cultures today, there is no support system. And that actually is becoming more of an issue in our culture today. So first of all, when I say support system, I mean like lots of people over the age of 62 or 65 or 67 are collecting Social Security. Now that's not free money because they paid into it over the years, but that is a built-in support system for people who otherwise might be fairly destitute or not have a whole lot, as well as everybody else who's paid into it. So in a setting, if you said the land is not going to go to family or the sheep are not going to go to family, you know what you have is you've set your family up to have absolutely nothing. No support system, no nothing. There's no unemployment check coming, there's no welfare, there's no Social Security. So family was all there was, basically, as a support system. So it went both ways. So if the father gave the inheritance to the son, well, part of the reason for that is because the son, the expectation is the children were going to take care of their parents as they got elderly. And so it was a mutually beneficial relationship. And that's what family's supposed to be in a setting where there was absolutely no other way to benefit. There was no other support system other than family, pretty much. In fact, if you look at the Old Testament, the only thing that other setting there is, and we've talked about this before, is God said, bring the tithe into the temple, and it was for the people who were destitute. It was for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner who had no job, no way to support themselves, who had come to a new land. So the only time anybody intervened in somebody's life is if they were destitute. And that's actually, in my opinion, that's probably a first when God set up the system of the tithe, because if you take a look at third world countries that are poorly led, there is no system for the widow and the orphan other than to stand by the side of the road and beg. And you see that in countries that you go to. In fact, there's a number of people I've talked to who don't like going to certain countries because of the poverty and the fact that there is no support system for hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, and all they're doing is standing on the street corner and begging to survive. So that's another reason, I think, for the idea of generational blessing and generational wealth being passed on, is because it was the primary way that people were supported in their elder years, as they were young and got, older. Anything else about that? Why does God value generational wealth? So one other thing I'll mention is I think generational wealth promotes righteousness. And if you feel free to push back on this, but one of the things that you see in tandem with generational wealth is the blessing from the parent to the child. And so it's not just about, and this is why I think we all get upset with the prodigal son, is because the prodigal son came to the father and says, I want my money now, which basically in that culture meant, Dad, I wish you were dead so I could have all your money. And so that ticks us off not just from a financial standpoint, that ticks us off from a relational standpoint, it ticks us off from a righteousness standpoint. And so the idea of having things properly passed down at the right time, in the right way, it's not just about passing money or sheep or land, it's about passing down the understanding of what righteous living looked like. And I think that, like, in the same way that God said to Abraham, because of your faith, I will bless you financially. I think that the idea of passing down generational wealth is also God saying, listen, it's not just about passing the money down. It's about passing the proper relationship between father and son, mother and daughter, that sort of thing. And then also it's about passing down the righteousness from the parents in their relationship with God and passing it to the children and the grandchildren. Because there's that constant flow in the Old Testament. Like when I started off, I said the flow is you pass land and you pass sheep. You don't just pass land and just pass sheep. You pass down righteousness. And so ultimately, I think it's a metaphor for what you're supposed to pass down to your children. Any thoughts on that?
I think of the Kennedy family, honestly. Whether, maybe not the righteousness, but they passed down wealth.
Mm-hmm.
They passed down civil responsibility.
Yep.
And it continues,
Mm-hmm.
to the youngest one now who's running for office. So that was kind of a good picture of what that's supposed to look like, and hopefully some righteousness.
So that actually brings me to mind of the next one that I'll mention is, so one of the things that, regardless of where we stand politically, we think to ourselves, there's a family that has prepared the next generation to be able to be successful. Yeah. And when we look at that, we say, isn't that good that families have done that? So what I would also suggest is that the idea of passing wealth, land, sheep, righteousness, taking care of, your parents, things of that nature, it's actually an apologetic. And when I use the term apologetic, it actually becomes proof for those who look on that living for God actually works well. So when people see, like the Kennedys, you bring that up, it's like, oh wow, that works well, how they, pass down, and they're all involved in civic, minded things. So when we properly pass down righteousness, as well as wealth, as well as all the rest of the things that go with a blessed life, people look on and watch that, and the hope is that they say to themselves, that's the kind of life I want to have. And especially if they don't have it, and so you, in the church would be a good example, is if you have multiple generations of family in one church, which unfortunately doesn't happen as much anymore because we move so much. But when you have that example, you have a young person who looks at that and says, my family hasn't been exactly righteous in my grandparents or my parents, and now I'm coming to church and I'm trying to build a life. I can watch their life and I can build my life on that righteousness that's passed down from generation to generation. So in a way, that generational wealth of righteousness and land and everything else is a proof that God's way actually works. And then it's a display to the whole world. Do it God's way, and it'll turn out well for you. And I do think that we need to be able to communicate, especially to people who have not gotten that kind of opportunity. Because there are people who we have people in this room who had no spiritual passing down in their life whatsoever and struggled to come to grips with, how do I live my life well? And so that can be, living your life well, generation to generation, can be a tremendous testimony to people.
Yeah. One comment about the, you said just hit home, was living a righteous life. And I don't think you can pass generational wealth down successfully without righteousness, because there's so many examples of people having generational wealth that turn out really bad without righteousness.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's the key. That's first.
Yeah. And see, in the Old Testament, that happens too. Is there's times when God really blesses a generation, and then the kids and the grandkids don't follow in righteousness, and exactly the word that's used in this chapter is squander.
Yeah.
They squander it because they live foolishly. They're happy to take all the money, but they don't want to live righteously.
Culturally, say like in the example, like Joseph and his brothers, or I know the eldest son was always the favored, but if there were 4 or 6 sons in a family, was the wealth distributed equally?
It would have been distributed, but it wasn't distributed equally, and there were specific reasons for that. So one of the things, you use the word, the oldest got more, or how'd you phrase that?
Well, it's the blessing that is passed to
But the oldest, so there's 2 sides to that. So that in some ways the eldest got more, but the eldest was also more responsible.
Right.
And so, for instance, the eldest was responsible for all the daughters. Now, it didn't mean that the younger sons weren't responsible at all for their sisters, but the eldest one was always the one most responsible for the women in the family, most responsible for mom, most responsible for his sisters, his nieces, his granddaughters, his grandnieces. So the greater amount was given to the eldest, but he was also more responsible than everybody else.
It wasn't always the oldest,
it was generally the oldest, but yeah, there were circumstances where it wasn't.
Well, even Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau is a prime example.
Esau was firstborn, but he sold his birthright.
Right.
So
He sold it, and then the follow-up is that
trickery.
that
A whole lot of
Jacob stole it. So yeah, that's a whole nother one.
Yet it was part of God's plan for him to receive the blessing.
So this verse, there's one other verse we'll discuss in here, and it's thrown in, although it comes up, this topic comes up in different places in Proverbs, but in this particular chapter, there's just one verse about it. And since all of us have grown children now, we can talk about this one without worrying about the authority showing up at our door. Verse 24, whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. flesh that out in what does proper discipline in the home look like. If anybody's watching and has kids, recognize that in this group, all of us, our kids are grown. So we have an opportunity to kind of look back on it and say, okay, what I do right, what I do wrong when it came to discipline. Was I too heavy-handed? Was I too lax with discipline? Things of that nature. But how do you flesh out proper discipline with just maybe, let's make a few statements about, if you're gonna sit down and, let's put it this way, if you're gonna sit down and talk with a young couple about how they discipline their children, what are some of the things you would tell them that how Scripture fleshes out these kind? Because not sparing the rod can mean many, many different things to different people. What are your thoughts about that verse?
Well, I think children by nature really, they desire discipline.
Mm-hmm.
They need some structure. I think it is important that we don't discipline in anger,
Mm-hmm.
and that we talk to them too and pray with them and talk about what they did, why it displeased God, and bring the whole, there's a whole side to it that I think sometimes parents are too quick to discipline and in anger, and then there's no spiritual teaching.
And the reference point is, why can't I do it? And things like, because I said so. So the parent becomes the ultimate authority rather than God Himself. Right. Yeah. So that idea of the fruit of the Spirit of self-control, understanding that you're disciplining for righteousness' sake. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, you mentioned right at the beginning the idea that children want to be disciplined. There's a study that was done some years back, and they took children out on a playground, and they used the exact same playground with both scenarios. But what they did first is they brought all the children out onto the playground, and there was no fence around the playground. And they observed where the children played. And they tended to stay very close to each other and to the swing set, teeter-totter, whatever was there. And they did not venture very far from those things, because that was the safe space they had kind of all figured out. So then they took the children off the playground another day, had them go out, same playground, but they had a fence all the way around it. And what they noticed is the children wandered farther. They'd go all the way to the fence. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because that was the safe space then, naturally, without them, anybody telling the children. It was, I have this whole space I can play. And so they'd even go and kind of climb the fence and look through the fence. And you may always have a kid who decides you're going to climb over the fence, but I don't think anybody did. So the issue is when you don't provide boundaries, there's anxiety that keeps discovery from happening. When you provide boundaries, they will use those boundaries, go to the very limits of the boundaries, and have more discovery and basically more opportunity. And I think that's fascinating, because it really is how kids operate, is if you tell them there are no boundaries, then they're going to be filled with anxiety. It's the same way where it's almost like, I don't tell kids nowadays, and some people might agree with me, is that you can do anything you want.
Right.
Because if you're 4'11", you're probably not playing basketball in the NBA. Now, I don't want to discourage you from being a good basketball player, because there's lots of good 4'11" basketball players, I'm sure. But if that's as tall as you got, then you're probably not going to make it to the highest level. You can still play basketball. So the issue is, when you tell kids there are no boundaries, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety that develops in their life. They need some sort of boundaries, and it starts with the boundaries of righteousness and then other things as well.
Well, I think too, like, just explaining to them, God gave us 10 commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And He gave those to us to keep us safe.
Yep.
And so, it's like, it's always kind of pointing, I believe it's kind of like training those children up in the ways of the Lord, and pointing them to God as of who they're going to answer to. Yes, you're their parent, and you're creating boundaries that God has given you to kind of guide them. But I think it's when they know that God's created them for His glory, and that He's given us these rules, and we all follow them, not just them, but the adults too.
Yeah.
And so then I think it helps them understand why.
Well, and the issue is you are teaching them discipline so that when they get older, they can self-discipline. If you don't teach them that there are boundaries, then they will not be able to self-boundary. They won't be able to self-discipline themselves. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, without the boundary, there becomes a lack of respect.
Mm-hmm.
Because how often do you see in our current culture these kids, what's the problem that's occurring now?
Teen takeovers.
Yeah. And stuff like that, where, I mean, it's 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, and because they haven't been given boundaries at home or wherever, there's a lack of respect for parents, for authority, for the police, for teachers. We can go on and on and on, and they'll do whatever they want to do.
Well, and see, the other thing about that is when you don't have the boundaries, and I'll use your example, take it to another level. If there's a bunch of 13, 14, 15-year-old kids that decide they're going to do a teen takeover, let me tell you something, there's a bunch of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who think, oh, these kids are going wild in the street, I can get away with stuff now, right, too. And if 14 and 15-year-old girls are doing teen takeovers, pity those girls, because once the community finds out about that, you're going to have your perverts coming out and things of that nature, and that happens in cultures that don't have boundaries. Is people end up getting abused and all sorts of things. Let's just verse 7. Let's read it again, and we'll close with this. This will be probably a little lighter, just because I'm just curious if anybody has any thoughts on this. Every verse seems like just filled with wisdom, really wisdom sayings. And then it says, one person pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. Is that a wisdom saying or an observation? That's because it can be true. I mean, you have people who have great wealth who, I mean, they don't show it off, and you never know that they do. I mean, it's not that you have people who do love to show off their wealth, but what do you think of that verse? Any wisdom? Because I have a hard time figuring that one out.
I worked with a gal years and years ago who drove a Mercedes 450 SL, had the most beautiful clothes, was homeless, nothing, but she wanted to look like she was a catch,
Wow.
So she really was very insecure about herself, and so these things made her appear to be successful or what have you.
Okay.
I think it really
So there
helped.
it's a real strong insecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I kind of like
I
the
don't know if it's
opposite
wisdom.
way, I can tell you. It was hilarious. I was into the restaurant, and I happened to have one of my shirts that had rather worn collar, and it was, I get ready to leave, and they said, oh, the people next to you paid for your meal for you. As I go out and get in my Cadillac and drive off.
Don's got a shtick going. He gets all his meals in town paid for,
That was just hilarious.
Poor old homeless Don. We gotta help him out, Oh, and maybe that's the whole idea. That's the wisdom behind it. If you want your meal paid for, make yourself look poor.
Is
Maybe
there
it's about not
wisdom
judging.
in the person observing?
Say again?
Is there wisdom in you said, is it wisdom or observance? And it's like, well, is there wisdom in the person observing? Because he's the questioning, okay, why is this what's the mode, what's the agenda but between both scenarios.
Yeah. Okay. So it's bringing up a point that once you think through, you start to see some worth to what's being said.
See,
Okay.
I thought it was if like one pretends to be rich, it has nothing, and I looked at that as like, okay, he's got while he flaunts it,
Mm-hmm.
but spiritually he's dead. Like that's where the poor person, they may be poor in wealth, but they have a great wealth spiritually. That's where I kind of thought it was leading. That it was talking about, yeah, you may not have a lot of money, but look at their faith, look at their spiritual growth, and that sort of. So I kind of read it like that.
The only thing I would say about that is it's the idea pretends.
Right.
You know, where it to me it's almost suggesting like this is just the natural way of things, like there's not a spiritual part to it. I'm not sure of that completely, but it's the idea of pretending that brings it down to me more of a physical level than a spiritual level, but I'm not sure of that.
If you insert instead of rich, like say in church, one man pretends to be a follower of Christ, yet isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Another pretends not to be a follower of Christ, but is.
Yeah, the biggest thing is I would say is the term is eisegesis, is being careful that we're not reading something into the text.
What's it called?
Eisegesis.
Eisegesis?
Eisegesis.
ISA?
ISOGESIS.
So that
Eisegesis. There's exegesis, and it's not Jesus at the end. Everybody thinks that because it's a spiritual term. So exegesis is when you properly understand the text. Eisegesis is when you read something into the text that's not there. And so changing the text like that may be pushing or reading something into the text that's not there.
Yeah.
Because and that, like I said, I'm not totally sure of what it means, why it's dropped in there. There's nothing around it that would give us a whole lot of help to understand, what's the wisdom behind that? Or, like I said, is it just an observation?
So I feel like that pride's involved, and here it says appearances are deceiving. Conceit will motivate a person to adopt a lavish lifestyle even though he actually has nothing. So that would be wisdom of recognizing that
That this is what
this is
some
a
people
conceited
do.
person.
Yeah. So, and it may be pointing to going back to kind of what Joni was saying about that woman is be aware that not everything is as it seems.
Yes.
Maybe that's one of the things that's trying to be pointed out in that particular phrase. It's a very interesting phrase. All right, that's chapter 13. And next week we'll jump into chapter 14. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful evening.
And we appreciate everyone who joined us tonight on the video.